A very warm good morning to you all. Thank you for joining us. This is our 5th day of our conference, Brics Roundtable Conference, Securing Brics and Transdisciplinary Perspective. I'm the facilitator for today. My name is George Mutalemwa, and we have 3 presentations today. We will start with the first one by Professor F. Bray, which is securing maritime security and the BRICS grouping of countries. Professor Ray is from the University of Stellenbosch here in South Africa. He is a trained and has served as an infantry officer in various postings in the Southern African National Defense Force. So we have a nice and rare combination of theory and practice. Professor Bray, you are welcome, and I welcome everybody also joining us virtually. So the floor is yours, Professor Bray.
Thank you. I just want to call up the PowerPoint because my computer just reset it. So let's give me a few seconds, please.
That's all right.
Right, I hope it. If we can move on, I'll be speaking about maritime security and the BRICS grouping of countries, and largely I will move on to my scope that I will discuss. So I'll broadly address matters pertaining to BRICS as a maritime entity through the oceans, current debates and pathways on maritime security, pursuing a BRICS maritime economy, outlooks for the maritime agenda, maritime security for a maritime economy, and then from economic to maritime security agendas. Now, if we look at narratives and declarations of BRICS, one of the features that one can track within the literature is that there's a growing trend to also bring matters of security into the outlooks of BRICS countries and in their declarations after each meeting. So, shaping the security agenda, we will see, for example, overall, broadly, Brazil looking towards shaping the Asian-centric, Russia to counter the Atlantic system shifting east, and we're seeing that playing out very graphically at the moment. And this was already type of alluded to quite a few years ago by 2 authors on BRICS and maritime matters. India has a rising status as a leading power. I think it's no secret where India is standing, and that it is surpassing China in terms of its population growth and the economy is growing as well. China looking to a governance system that suits its political and economic rise, and then South Africa as a recognized actor and a gateway to Africa. So, just shut down again. So let's use it. So if we look at shaping the security agenda, the reformists for evolutionary change is a pathway, and then the general narrative to avoid confrontation towards change, and the extensive use of soft power and image building, that's something that Brics countries really have to attend to. The idea for Brics countries of mobility in the international system and status and following strategies towards building that, and the idea of peaceful coexistence for global integration, and then for Brics in particular, new regionalism of globally networked regions. But if we return to the maritime topic on this, the political footing for maritime economic cooperation is very clearly articulated in the 10th Brics Summit that was in Johannesburg in 2018. And in the blue, you can see the explicit reference to maritime matters that have to be addressed in bringing in the maritime agenda into the overall Brics grouping, its objectives and what it stands for. So if we look at that blue narrative, this was in 2018. Unfortunately, if we track this in the Brics declaration since 2018, the maritime topic did not really feature again. So if we top of say, but is Brics a maritime grouping, then we must remember that the oceans is the common connectivity landscape bordering essential trade routes, and that 5 of the 16 largest EEZs are taken up in the Brics setup. So the region building and what the objectives they pursue, want to pursue or state must be inclusive of maritime landscapes. So you could also look at a virtual regional maritime bloc that in fact represents continental gateways via maritime pathways to the different continents. In this one, just one of the regional entities is the one around South Africa that is shaded in green, that includes the maritime landscapes of SADC countries, because each of these entities sit within a larger regional grouping, inherently, implicitly, or very explicitly, like SADC for South Africa, which of course brings about a very large maritime landscape into the Brics grouping if you have influence over that region. If we look at Brics as a future entity with the type of notion of countries that can join up with Brics, this is what it can look like in the near future. The one that's marked in red is Pakistan. I have serious doubts Pakistan will be allowed into Brics while India is a part of Brics. But nevertheless, we must understand that the China-Pakistan connection is very strong around this. So what we see is that you've got these large entities that can take shape around very critical maritime routes, the Malacca Straits, the Strait of Hormuz, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and then also up into the Suez Canal. And if Algeria, that is now in South Africa, to speak about Brics, joins up obviously the Strait of Gibraltar, the entrance to the Mediterranean. I'm not so sure why it keeps on shutting down.
So can you please move to this one? Have your presentation.
Okay, yeah, fine with it. Because now oftentimes the computer wants to update. So this is what a potential future Brics grouping can look at. With the interesting part, if you look at the countries that I mentioned, they are all littoral countries. I only know of 2 other countries that are not littoral, Kazakhstan and Afghanistan, that's also floating into the picture somewhere. But if we look at maritime security for Brics around maritime governance, then we get to the picture on your screen about a realism versus liberalism. And what we have is that the maritime security for Brics countries is based on maritime cooperation. There is no other way that you can use and promote security on the oceans if you cannot cooperate with partners, even partners you don't like. So the constructive cooperation agendas to pursue the collective interests is really very critical, because the global economy is maritime-based, and the maritime-based global economy is served by good order at sea. And we only have to look at a few matters around the Red Sea of Somalia and in the Gulf of Guinea to see what happens to shipping, what happens to prices, what happens to crude oil prices, if there's any suspicion of bad order at sea on that part of the ocean. So the good maritime security governance is a common responsibility and, of course, a catalyst for maritime economies to do well. Therefore, if we turn our attention to Brics, pathways to look at connecting the centers of production and control over critical routes and choke points that we pointed out on the map, then we have to look at these countries as their national territories, their EEZs, the high seas, and then understand that in the 21st century, as we speak now, this connectivity and communication is both physical and digital sea lines of communication that are now developing rapidly. Shipping on the surface and underwater infrastructure, cabling, connectivities, and transporting certain goods and resources along the ocean floor. So you can go the pathway of cooperation as a clever community or corporation and responsible management, and use maritime diplomacy to promote collaboration and persuasion. Or you can go into competition where you follow a revisionist one, and obviously whether soft or whether subdued or very nude or very confrontational, revisionism is on the cards for Brics. I mean, they're very explicit about which system they want to change. And then you can go confrontation, you can build alliances, you can militarize, or you can coerce through naval diplomacy. I think if we look at the right-hand block, we already see, I think Russia has made its point about what it wants to change and how it wants to oppose it, although it's on land. Therefore, the big uproar about the naval exercises off the coast of South Africa with two of these Brics countries at the moment, between South Africa, Russia, and China, because this is all in the mix about how to change the system and where do you want to position yourself in the system. However, if we look on the maritime side, the cooperation through a community, a regional, virtual community, is probably a way to go. But this is up to politicians that we think and that we expect will think clearly and soberly about this, but apparently not always. So, in pursuit of a maritime economy for Brics, we need to consider the maritime trade flows, the space and geography, expanded regional maritime scenarios as areas of influence. Remember the map with the green shading around SADC as part of an influence sphere for Brics, and then more access to resources. Remember the whole gist of where are the resources of the future located has a very, very strong and a very thick line that runs into the oceans, whether in the oceans or below the ocean floor. We've got the whole idea of the International Seabed Authority that's working on that. So, oceans governance on using the seas is something that must be addressed by ways of technologies and energy and global leadership that must go there. We see the Indo-Pacific nexus is within the Brics ambit, area of contestation, where country of the big groupings in Brics are already taking up positions around this, with India leaning more towards the Quad and much less towards Brics. What we have to understand from Brics, there's no military cooperation, naval cooperation agreement within Brics. There's no such, the closest they come to this is maritime security cooperation that they stated in the Johannesburg Declaration. But the ties, obviously, in Brics, the ties go beyond the Indo-Pacific region. We have the southern nexus to Brazil, the South Atlantic, where South Africa is obviously the link to Brazil and the South Atlantic for the bigger groupings that could come onto line. And this is all about energy, sea routes, markets, but absent competition in the Brics grouping that is still, I think, finding its feet on maritime matters, maritime security, and how to map out the cooperation required to make maximum use of the sea territories that are at play if you should have a current or an extended Brics grouping. And that this also is a gateway to Africa. And I think we are not uninformed in South Africa about the outreach, the work, the presence, and the building of footprints on the African continent, in particular by Russia and China, to an extent, of course, then by India, and much less by Brazil on the south, on the western fringes of the continent, and then South Africa with a small footprint from the south. So, what are the Brics country outlooks on maritime governance? And here we've got that the member states, as they currently display, that they've got, Russia's got its maritime doctrine of the Russian Federation that is part of a guidepost for it. China's 13th Five-Year Plan for Maritime Economic Development. If you read the literature on China, not specifically China in Brics, but on China, it has got a very, very explicit focus on the oceans, how to use the oceans, where do they want to go with it, how they should build their capacity, and what kind of technology and industrialization is being prioritized. And much of it points to be able to operate on the oceans, in the oceans, and down to the ocean floor and the seabed. Brazil has the Atlantic Energy Renaissance program, given the big energy resources in the Atlantic off the coast. And then South Africa's got Operation Pakisa's Oceans Leg, that is, of course, a very ambitious, underplayed, and somewhat neglected oceans focus from the South African governance. But all of this, and that is why that bottom line is in red, the maritime policies and strategies of these different member states that we've mapped out there to bring this to fruition, to plug it into what was said in the Johannesburg Declaration, it's about alignment and governance. And on the oceans, this is of critical importance because you cannot duplicate what you do on land and think you can do it at sea. It's really a different ballgame. So, the maritime cooperation, you have to contend with diversity and discordance in the Brics grouping. Now, this is not very explicit, and the reason why it's not explicit is because in the Johannesburg Declaration, they stated what lines should be followed, what they are interested in, where the attention should go. And then it seems that a type of drop down the agenda, dropped a bit off the radar. But maritime economic programs, you can have a maritime economic program, but to interface it with other countries, and then countries that are not in a geographic proximity, that takes some doing. They have to participate in improved global maritime governance because this is the underlying structure upon which you have to operate on the oceans. Are you going to operate in a competitive, conflictual world? Or are you going to operate in a world that is stressed, confrontational? And that is to an extent what we are seeing at the moment. But Brics countries will have to be in the global maritime governance game because countries are writing the rules at the moment. And you have to be part of that to write the rules. How are you going to operate at sea and how governance on the sea is going to take place? So priorities, agenda setting and institution buildings within the Brics bloc is something that must find a footprint, it must find fruitful ground. Otherwise, it remains every country is going to work in its own. And to be able to have a maritime system for a maritime economy for Brics with its explicit maritime economic agenda, this is something they have to attend to. And then you've got a skewed maritime economic capabilities. On the one hand, you have China, you've got Russia. China with the economic side, its navy, its security agencies to operate at sea, growing by the day. Russia with its navy being at sea. We only have to look at South Africa to see about their reach, although it's symbolic. But what does Brazil really bring? And what does South Africa bring to this? So is South Africa, for example, playing in this league? Or does it only want to be in the picture alongside the big players because of solidarity reasons? So a form of Brics maritime economic system, in fact, is absent. And that was written by Zunhua from China to say that this is what is absent. It's just not there. So the traditional and non-traditional maritime security are elements that need attention. So on the traditional side, in the matrix that I showed earlier in the bottom left quadrant, it's about the hard matters: national security, naval warfare, fighting terrorism at sea, using your navy to create good order at sea. The other three quadrants are all in the non-traditional maritime security ambit, where you have to make use of other measures, policing measures, capacity building, legislation, getting your legislation in place, integrating your legislation, building partnerships, building coast guards, because there you can't use your navy to fight your way through human security, through environmental security, build your economy, protect your economy. So Brics countries must strengthen their national maritime environments because cooperative maritime security is severely lagging in the Brics grouping of states. So if we can start moving towards the end, this is from economic to maritime security agenda. Maritime-wise, these two feed upon each other. That is the cycle that Jeffrey Till illustrates in his books on sea power in the 21st century. The better you build your capability to protect your trade and to make the oceans safe and keep them safe, the better it becomes for trade and commerce to build your economy that, in fact, part of that again frees up resources to strengthen your ability to help, to cooperate, and even in your own waters at the national level, to keep your oceans safe in order for trade and commerce and the safe exploitation of the resources, your living and non-living resources, and to use the oceans as a flow and stock resource under safe conditions. So ocean governance is an international responsibility. Brics countries must cooperate in this. It's a competition, but they have to cooperate to give their inputs. So good governance at sea feeds economic development, and this is about cooperating to protect and sustain so that you can profit more from your economic means, your economic gains, your economic benefits, and your economic access that you have. This, of course, is why you've got this constant competition now of countries that want to delimit their maritime zones, their coastal waters, their exclusive zones, etc., because that's where the new resources are. But you can't claim it if you don't have jurisdiction. So in order to extend jurisdiction, you have to play within the rules of UNCLOS. But now countries go at loggerheads because in the case of China and the South China Sea, the rule is you go to an international tribunal. The international tribunal made a ruling and China does not agree with the ruling. So the other part, of course, is energy security, Brics production and importation profiles. We know what Russia produces, we know what Brazil produces, India to a lesser extent, China to a lesser extent, South Africa even less on energy. But importation profiles tells a different story. So the question is, can you configure and reconfigure within the international system, amongst others, your sea jurisdiction over territories where you can exploit the energy resources in under your jurisdiction on and offshore. So we've got a stable South Atlantic, and then we've got the Indo-Pacific sea lines of communication that play a role. These have to be secured. You can only overlay a map of shipping, traffic, commerce, etc., and fishing to see how this fits into these two huge ocean territories. And then, of course, secured subsea communication infrastructure, that is this rising topic of investigation at the moment that's upcoming. Brics, for example, is planning and in process of running an undersea cable all the way from China in the east right down to Brazil. How do you protect that cable? It's a dedicated Brics underwater cable for communication. But to who does it belong? How do you protect it? One way is that you can protect it if you've got your way stations all the way to Brazil. So, and what is the future of sea lines communication in the Middle East? It makes sense why you've got those blue triangles all along that route of potential aspirant BRIC member states that maybe could join BRICS in the future. So how do we go about this? You can use physical assets, your traditional Navy, Coast Guard, and policing assets. You can have bottom left or virtual assets, space and underwater infrastructure to know what's going on in the waters, or by proxy, critical sea territories of BRICS members, because you can start connecting the dots from Russian waters all along through China, through India, down to South Africa to BRICS. And of course, it would be a great bonus if you can connect the dots into the Strait of Hormuz, if you can connect the dots into the Red Sea and connect it up into the Suez Canal, and maybe even to the Straits of Gibraltar. So the pathways are most probably best pursued through diplomacy and capacity building, with capacity building being, this is where countries you want to work with, you have to help them to operate on the sea as well and drive back sea blindness that so many countries dwell upon. So almost in conclusion, what I'm trying to say, we have to deal with a maritime security deficit for secure oceans, safe oceans, but maritime security is not prioritized in the Brics grouping. The common maritime security interests are vaguely articulated. Unfortunately, political animosities on land have liminality at sea. What happens on land spills into the oceans. It is not only country-to-country confrontation, but also if you have insurgencies, if you have bad order on land, bad security governance on land, eventually the effect plays out at sea. Somalia, Yemen, in the north we've got Libya, we've got Mozambique, we've got certain islands in the Malacca Strait. What happens on land is detrimental to how to use the oceans. So maritime security is a precondition for maritime economic cooperation. And you can start off with security in less sensitive fields, and the maritime domain lends itself to this, and that you therefore have to expand the space in Brics for maritime security cooperation to underpin this explicit economic agenda of the Brics grouping. So in conclusion, there's a visible shift to security in the Brics declarations. And the 10th summit in 2018 brought the maritime security and the maritime economic connection into the declaration. But the question is Brics evolving as a maritime community, a club or an alliance? Dominance of littoral countries in a Brics plus. That gives some clout, that gives impetus, that brings opportunities. Maritime security is also part of transformation of international affairs, and the Brics grouping is explicit about this, but there's a maritime side to that as well. You have to play in the international law, the international picture of the maritime drives that are going on. And are you going to play in the drive for, this is about national security, I use the oceans, if it's mine, I exploit it like I want to, and I compete even by coercion for other territories? Or is it the cooperative side about how do you cooperate for future oceans that are productive, that's clean, and that you can leave to a future generation and not leave dead seas, but very productive and green seas or clean seas for the future? Because the economic and developmental ambitions are maritime-based as well, and therefore you need to see that geography, institutions, and your programs that you run in Brics are aligned. It is necessary for prioritizing a securitized maritime blue Brics if you want to bring this very lucrative potential on board in Brics. So thank you for this. There's the references I made use of mostly to prepare this presentation. So thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Bray, for this wonderful presentation on maritime security and the Brics grouping of countries. You've taken us through really a very important analysis of the situation on the ground. And it's time now for questions and comments from the panelists as well as participants who are viewing us, who are joining us online. And to begin with, I would like to ask you to explain a little bit more about the absence of an agreement that's written regarding maritime security amongst the Brics countries, and the absence of military presence. Is it because capacity building is viable and diplomacy, or this is done deliberately, that the military aspect is excluded. Thank you, Prof.
Okay, with regards to the question on formalized cooperation, I do think there's a trajectory from where Brics started off. And you have to do a content analysis of the declarations every time. What I looked at is the fact that the world's economy is maritime-based. And the maritime-based economy, if China is fast becoming the largest economy in the world, then the fact that the global economy is maritime-based is of critical importance for China. So the difficulty that I picked up is that this is very important for all countries. But if you look at the literature, I would go so far as to say the country that's most explicit of getting it right at sea and becoming a player at sea and to be able to contribute to good order at sea and be able to play in that league is China. Russia can play that part, but I don't know if Russia can play a part beyond a naval part. And that creates the dilemma. There's no provision in Brics for any military cooperation, with this exception that the narratives in terms of what Brics stands for is migrating towards security cooperation. Because remember that Mosey and the cooperation that's taking place now was something in terms of an agreement, but it's not a Brics agreement. I don't want to say by chance, because Mosey and the naval cooperation came into being after South Africa joined Brics. But it's not a Brics arrangement. It's nowhere within the Brics agreement, cooperation, etc., but it's taking place.
And there's a narrative around it.
Yeah.
That it's Brics.
It's a narrative that was created, but it's not a formal Brics event between Brics members. The other part that what you can gather from the maritime security side, and this was written particularly and very critically by the Chinese author, is that the Brics grouping, because you've got China at the top and you've got South Africa at the bottom and everyone in between, they've got maritime agendas, but these maritime agendas are not aligned. And you need this alignment if your maritime agenda and building maritime security becomes the platform upon which you conduct your maritime trade and commerce to build your economy. And that the divergence, and that you don't really see this as it's building up in since 2018, that it's building up in the declarations, it's absent. And when you go and dig into the individual countries, you will also see that they have these different outlooks and that they've got these different ambitions and that they've got different capabilities to be able to pursue maritime security. They all are utterly dependent upon a maritime economy that operates well, safely, and uninterrupted on good governed oceans. That the maritime ability to deal with maritime security and the capacity is that some of the countries have the capacity and they are rapidly building the capacity to play that role. And some of the countries like South Africa is, well, let's call it, it's just not in the picture. To make a contribution to that be probably not even beyond its own limited waters, not even to speak about its economic zone. So there's more work to be done, because the idea that a lot of the work has been done to bring this package together, no, it's not there. In Brics.
Thank you so much, Professor Ray and Professor Brooks.
So my question is there a formal Brics security, broad security advisory body? And if so, then we need to get an ear with them. And if not, I think we should work to establishing one, because we can have workshops and we can do research and we can write papers. But if that is not in place, we're not going to make a change.
I think the one that is most progressive at the moment in terms of security is probably the one on cybersecurity. Then the idea about bringing maritime security into the picture would be to look at existing security arrangements, whether they are embryonic or whether they are merely being discussed. But the trick and the importance is you must hook the maritime theme onto that. Because, for example, what we do is when we do maritime security, we try to link it to cybersecurity, because that is very important. Because if you look at a trend, the first one is that if you look at upcoming maritime security policies and frameworks that countries are writing at the moment and completed in the recent past, they entered two prominent new domains. The one is cyber, the other one is underwater infrastructure that must be protected. And those are two new domains. And my question is, okay, if we look at Brics countries, how do they integrate this? So there's not an existing stepping stone upon which you can step and bring this into the Brics security agenda, because the Brics security agenda is not about maritime security at the moment. You will have to force it into that agenda where they've got subgroupings in Brics that deals with matters of security, keeping in mind that the security notions that we are talking about has not developed in time per annum as the Brics meetings and declarations came out. It only started to enter at the later stage. And the big criticism that the Chinese author here that he raises around this is that the institution building must take place, because how do you do this? You have to build capacity, you have to build institutions, you have to build agencies, and you have to build narratives, and you have to build consensus around this. And the criticism is it's there, but it's all over the place. Every country has got its own little package that it can bring to the table, but where's the table?
Thank you so much. If I can start with Professor Regina.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. You have put on the table a lot of very important problems. And one of them is just the maritime security. We consider Brics as an intergovernmental alliance. And every government certainly has priorities. And to put maritime activities into the development of declarations and any other kind of administration, it is important to suggest to the governments something concrete that will be of an interest from economic and political point of view by all means. Because there are a lot of different strands and activities. But if we think about the maritime activity that was mentioned already in Johannesburg Declaration, to develop it, I think it should be some mechanisms suggested. The first, probably the oil extraction from water on the basis of platforms. It will be useful because each of our countries is surrounded by water to a certain extent. and there are national reserves. And just within this project can be different kind of participation. Just in place near Brazil, South Africa, China, India, Russia with its northern route from one side. Then it can be any kind of administration, financial or engineering management, secure management in cyber world sphere, things like that. That is one possible trend of the mutual activity that can be an interest to our countries. It goes without saying that technologies already exist, and possibility to join the project from the very beginning as an idea to within the whole process to the end as implementation of the project. There is a place for any country, for any Brics country, and not only Brics plus, and so on. As an outreach, it will be of an interest. This extraction oil on the basis of water platforms. It's one aspect. Then the northern route. The northern part also is a question of a security for any country, because frankly speaking, the borders just within the polar region is not yet nominated, and there is a kind of a discussion. And in the meanwhile, within the border of the Russian Federation and neutral zones, there is a possibility, just to develop, and it is also developed actually, the Northern Route project with participation of Brics countries. Anyway, as I have mentioned, probably South Africa or Brazil are not so near as other countries, Brics countries, to the region. There is another way, different kind of possibilities to find its just participation in any business project. So the question is of priorities. Actually, South Africa has a privilege because it's just the chairman within Brics at the moment. As it was mentioned by Johannesburg Declaration, there is in your hands to make a kind of proposal with the help of probably our research, backed by to the think tank group that is presented by South Africa to develop the maritime aspect, taking into consideration the priority of any country to make the lives of people better, to extract, for example, some natural resources on the basis of mutual cooperation, and just to put it into action within Brics countries. That can be participation just of Brazil, Africans, and so forth, different ways, described ways, just half a page. And it goes. And then there will be priorities. If the country sees that there is an interest, economic interest, there are priorities. I have already mentioned, I can give you an example. In China, when they are strictly confidential within some of strategic projects, they open the ways and routes for those who they would like to have some kind of investments in the project by other countries, not only financial ones. Russia has opportunities, the financial opportunities, technical opportunities to invest, and any country can find itself within these two, just at least two projects that are of interest. I know for sure because within the financial university under government of the Russian Federation, we have made research concerning the extraction of national resources from just all over the world on the basis of such kind of water platforms. That is the maritime activity from one point of view, and from the other, it's any activity that we have within Brics linked with security problems. And to secure activity within maritime aspects, blue trend of activity, just in this ways. It's the question of securitization and prioritization of our country's participation. Thank you very much indeed. What do you think about
I think that one must keep two matters in mind. The one is, how do you cooperate and build partnerships in order to conduct, construct, and execute such projects? That's the one. The second part is, how do you cooperate and build the capacity to make sure that that extraction of that resource, the one that you mentioned around energy, takes place in waters where good order at sea reigns? Who brings that about?
So
there's two packages that must
observed.
be built.
Yeah, should be studied. But it's within the public-private partnership activity, because no private company can afford it, because it's the huge and expensive project, any kind, whether it is extracted. Yeah, it takes funds, time, and management. Yeah, you mentioned. I would like also to stress the point, the question of concurrency. Yeah. There is a concurrency on the basis of private institutions within the market. But if there is the intergovernmental interest or the intergovernmental alliance that Brics is just the possibility to make priorities for different projects, to select, to choose within the competition somebody who would just be within it and develop it, giving the facilities to the participants to accelerate the projects. It's the question of discussions, yeah, and if we consider the project as the business line, we have an idea and confess that it's very important for the countries to cooperate within the maritime activity, yeah, then it should be studied. It's the way of the research, because it's just a kind of research, development, implementation. That's it. And any question can be solved if there is an interest of the government, economic and political. And if there is an economic interest, there is a political one. Actually, we have the political interest because we have Brics within, and there are a lot of aspects that are our mutual interest of our countries. Then there is an economic one that should be supported. So just they are linked. That's it. The recipe is just to study it. Just if there is an interest, study it and go further. That's it. Because we have examples within the energy sector of different projects with participation of different countries in different regions and things like that, but not only in Russia, just all over the world. Our engineers from Gazprom and some other institutions with government state participation, they take this responsibility effectively, not only just within oil, just extraction, but also atomic energy and things like that. And the future shows that probably there can be also the hydrogen energy products that is very expensive, but in the long run, the future is, yeah. But actually, we're speaking about the maritime. I have expressed my point of view. It's up to you as to a scientist that is within the sphere as a practitioner and just a scientist to judge. But having an experience being the advisor to the board of directors of Gazprom Bank, that is the leading bank within the energy, I consider that it is possible from the financial and economic point of view. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now we can turn to Professor Adjus. If you could please ask your question or make your comment. And we also like to invite the participants who are joining us online, prepare their questions. You can put them in chat or just raise your hand. Thank you very much. Professor Adjus, please.
Thank you. My question may show my ignorance, but I'd like to know if the commitments to Brics maritime security has to intercalate at all with Commonwealth responsibilities and any other country that has a say over what we do with our ports, etc. Is there any conflict between the commitment to the Commonwealth and to BRICS at security level at the sea?
Okay, which Commonwealth do you refer to?
The UK Commonwealth,
Okay, okay,
yeah,
right.
the Commonwealth that the Queen was in charge of.
No, I just want to make sure that
Okay.
we're talking about the
Yeah.
same entity. I don't have a good answer for that because it depends on where countries want to place their energy, who do they want to work with, and who do they see as partners of the future. Do they see the Commonwealth as the pathway towards the future, or do they see BRICS as a better pathway towards the future? The BRICS agenda is very much to change the existing system to work better for everybody, or to work probably better for BRICS countries that see themselves as type of leading lights to make the system better for the global south in general. So if you talk about this, whether the Commonwealth fits into the picture as a competitor or a partner, I don't know. The thing with this is that because the bigger economic system, the global economy, is absolutely integrated and interdependent. My answer to that would be, first, who do you really want to work with, and who do you want to prioritize in your cooperation in order to pursue objectives? And secondly, how do you work with other partners in achieving an outcome, even working with partners that you don't like, working with partners that typically could hold some kind of risk. And I want to conclude by saying two things. You work on those matters, cooperate on those matters where you have common ground, number one. And secondly, you work in partnerships where people can work together in spite of, at the higher political level, where they just won't cooperate with anybody, with that country or that grouping. So you work where you have common ground, and you work probably at a lower level because you don't want to showcase to the world that South Africa is cooperating closely with the United States. But below the surface, a lot of cooperation is going on. My focus is just on the maritime side, because the questions are, if you made this declaration, where did it go? Why there's no further real development? Or is it a question that the maritime cooperation, the maritime economy, and maritime security type of cascaded into all the sub-entities, and now each one is doing something about it, but you can't really measure what outcome there is, because maritime cooperation is fundamentally about being good, professional, and experts of cooperating with different entities to bring about maritime security. And too many countries and agencies, that's where they stumble, to bring all these different entities together in order to address an outcome.
Yes, please.
Dear Prof, just for sure, there are a lot of American, British, German, other European companies within the energy activity. They are within Russia at the moment, in spite of any sanctions being presented by the other institutions, even by other countries. But we know, well, the origin, the real origin, and they know that we know. And we are just within the process of cooperation. With Commonwealth, it's no problem. they will join if there is an economic
I just wanted
interest.
to know if there was any intercalation
Yeah.
or one against the other, what was happening with those agreements.
Well, the thing is that there is the activity of Brics in the interest of Brics. If it is in the interest of the alliance, it's their interest that should be protected and secured. The professor has noted from all points of view. And the intention of others who will not like to pass the interest within that, they should find their way. Just taking one cap off, putting another cap off, and that's
Well, the thing around here is, please correct me if I'm wrong. South Africa and India, to an extent, are tied into the Commonwealth, but they're also a small and a big player in Brics. So you're not going to withdraw from the one because you want to be part of the other one. You stay part of both because I can get A, B, and C from the Commonwealth, but I can't get it from Brics. But I can get X, Y, and Z from Brics, but I can't get it from the Commonwealth. In South Africa's case, MNO I can get from SADC and from the European Union, but I can't get it from Brics. So that is the nature of the beast.
yeah, and of any activity. Yeah.
It is coming with tension at some levels, of course. I mean, if you think about India, the Quad, the Brics, the Commonwealth alliances, if you put them together, there's obviously some tension in managing your participation in all of them. Just think from an intelligence cooperation perspective, India cooperating and sharing intelligence in the Quad environment, that will inevitably have problems and creating problems in sharing intelligence in the Brics environment. So there's tensions in how countries manage this, and you see it in South Africa as well. In fact, in South Africa, it's even deeper at a deeper level where economically, South Africa perhaps is more aligned towards the West and the Western alliances, whilst the ruling party's outlook is political outlook and ideological outlook is perhaps more aligned with the Brics environment. So there's tensions in managing this. So it's not just about putting the one head off and taking the other head off. It's sometimes difficult doing that.
Frankly speaking, there's always tension in any kind of an activity. And from the other point of view, nothing goes against law. And from the third point of view, any country can take its own decision if it's just independent. And the push to the country in any sort of decisions, it's anyway the choice of the country. Whether to accept it as the push from somebody that you should do this or that, and otherwise it should be detention, or just to think about the economic interest and the better living of its people, as the example of the European countries has shown. Time will show, but anyway, I consider that any country has the privilege, I will repeat it, to consider what it wants. Nobody should just oppress or just, it's quite clear. There are different points of view. And if there is a particular political tension this time, and it can be another kind of tension the other time, we are just working within these tensions, taking them into consideration, but anyway, moving forward. As far as the Russian part is concerned, successful. Thank you.
The one matter that gets raised on the maritime side about connecting the dots. does Brics have a system of decision making to decide where how high the priority for the maritime security is? And do they have a system? How do they decide who to let in to Brics and where to say no? How are they going to do this? But the one about allowing more countries in or declining is one thing. The other one is, how do you push the maritime topic up the Brics agenda so that it becomes taken up again in the next, for example, declaration? Because how does that work? How do you push it out? Because it's been there and then it type of kept on dropping back. So how do you keep pushing it up onto the agenda?
I do understand your question. There are several vehicles within Brics. Actually, as we are acting as academicians, yeah? There is an academic forum each year that is being prepared by think tanks of different countries, and this year we are honored and happy to have South Africa as the chairman of this activity. It's an academic forum. Another vehicle is the regular meetings of our ministers in different spheres of economy and finance. Then there are frequent meetings of our central bankers, aside the Minister of Finance, who is within the ministerial team, just to think about how to manage it all, as far as the usage of development of our national currency is concerned, and just the introduction of the single currency by gold. It's just the question of the central bank on one side and of the ministers. Then there are working groups on each type of activity. It is reasonable if there is a proposal to the academic forum, starting from the think tanks that we discuss. We meet together, we discuss the priorities, we choose them, we just submit it to our Sherpas, and the Sherpa from the South Africa should declare it to the head of the state, that this and that aspects are important. Then the declaration by Sherpas signed. Then the declaration of the leaders of our states are signed, and then the ministerial teams are working on the basis of these documents, implementing them. Just to attract attention to the maritime activity and the securitization in different spheres, there is a trade relations. Anyway, there are a lot of aspects within that. We should start either from the ministry or just as academicians from the academic side, because we try and do the following. So to put together science, research, and practice. Yeah. Or we are on the research side and just the working groups and ministerial meetings on the practical side. Or it can be just both. But if it is mentioned within the Johannesburg Declaration, it has a good way, because it's not, the beginning is always difficult. It's the good possibility and the good challenge to move forward.
Thank you so much, Professor Yadegina, for the comments and questions. Thank you all the participants, all the panelists, and the participants who are joining us online. And especially I thank Professor Bray for this wonderful presentation. I know this has been very eye-opening and even mind tickling, as it were. And so this actually means that we're going to continue the conversation and think through these important aspects of maritime security and the issues around that and the cooperation. So I would like that we adjourn this conversation for now. Professor Buda?
I have a last question.
Yes, please. Mr. Shetland.
On that picture there of the campus, I think if I remember correct, slightly on the left is a small little church. Yeah. And I want to know if the students, I visited that campus in, I think, 1984. Tinus van Staden and Eric Rabi studied there. And I want to know if the students still, when they come back from the pub late night, ring the bell of the church before they go home.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much.
We stretch our legs while we
Now it's better.
take a 2-3 minute break.
That's right.
Just stretch our legs. While we stitch this up.
Yes, we are online, and so we'll have just 2 or 3 minutes just for taking in some fresh air, and then we'll continue with our second presentation for today. Thank you very much.
That one.
We don't know why in the world this now wants to update the world.
Yeah.
Open this.
This one, otherwise.
Sure.
I don't show it. Yeah. Yeah, boy. There is a
Welcome back to the second presentation for today, where we are discussing economy and security, exploring military cooperation in Brics. And we are honored to have Professor Abel Estreza, who is a professor of strategy in the Faculty of Military Science at Stellenbosch University here in South Africa, and the South African Military Academy. It's a pleasure having you, Professor, and we are also happy to invite all the participants who are joining us online. And I'm happy also to be among this esteemed group of panelists. So the floor is yours, Professor. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the introduction. I've been following you on WhatsApp the last couple of days, and it seems as if you've all been having some good time in Cape Town. So I was asked to do and to talk about land power. Francois coming in from a maritime perspective. I'm going to come in from a land power perspective. And I have to set the scene by saying that, as in the case of the maritime environment, it's probably a story of connection, of possible cooperation, of convergence. In the case of land power, it is a question of disconnect, questions about cooperation that's coming up, and perhaps divergence more than convergence. So I want to sort of use there you are. I want to use three meta-theoretical ideas: the nature of land power, looking at the unfolding of the geostrategic landscape from a land power perspective, and then, of course, the 7 contexts of strategy as outlined by Professor Colin Gray in his writings. In terms of land power, I assume that those in the audience is not always working with this concept, but it's in essence the military capabilities that's flowing from armies and their ability to deliver strategic effect on land, unlike the navies that working at sea. And I want to say 2 things about land power. The fact that land power, firstly, is a deeply human-centric instrument of power. I always tell my students that if you don't have aircraft, and you don't have ships, you don't have a navy, and you don't have an air force. But if you have people, you have an army. Whether you arm them with gumboots and sticks, but if you have people, you have an army. And it is perhaps this reality that is linking armies in a way to the state and to people that the Navy and the Air Force is not linked. People live on land, and armies are people-driven instruments of power. And so the public opinion matters much more in the deployment of the army than in the case of the Navy and the Air Force. Of course, it's difficult to deploy armies. It's cumbersome instruments to deploy, unlike the Air Force and the Navy. We've seen the difficulty of bringing armies home once they are deployed last year in Afghanistan and also in Iraq. So it's a cumbersome instrument of power. It's a difficult instrument of power to the extent that land power has staying power. Once you have deployed them, they are deployed. It's difficult to pull them out. Of course, land power is also inextricably linked to the land and to geography. What armies can and cannot do is dictated by land. You cannot deploy tanks on Table Mountain for very obvious reasons. And so it is the geographical realities of the land that dictates in making armies such a persistent instrument of power and such a slow and cumbersome instrument of power. But there's nothing that can occupy land like armies. So just a sort of a theoretical point. If you look at BRICS from a land power perspective, not from a maritime perspective, but from a land power perspective, the story is somewhat different from that of a maritime army. You obviously see the countries in the north and the countries in the south from a land power perspective. From a land power perspective, there's huge distances that's coming into play. And so what I want to do is to look at each current member of BRICS and to say a little bit about how the personnel and geographical variables come into play in terms of their security outlook. And the first country I want to look at, of course, is Russia. And the first point I want to make about Russia is that the strategic orientation of Russia have always been to the West. Russia is inextricably tied to the strategic realities of Europe. Time and distance, and perhaps the Ural Mountains have always protected Russia from the east. There's the white outback that I want to call the area east of the Ural Mountains. So from a historical, economic, industrial, demographic, and agricultural perspective, the western part of Russia have always been the most critical part. And of course, that also highlights the importance of what Russia referred to as the near abroad and the importance of buffer states for Russia. And of course, then if you look at it from a distance perspective, NATO is just a couple of hundred miles from Moscow, and that matters in Russia's security outlook, whether we like it or not. If you look at Russia, then from a land power and people-driven perspective, of course, there's a number of interesting demographic realities that's coming into play and that one needs to consider, and that's being discussed in depth more recently with what is unfolding in the Ukraine. Some authors and analysts described it as a perfect demographic storm. I'm not going to dwell on the reasons underpinning that. There's a lot of discussions. We have a lot of Russian wives in South Africa. That's part of become an important export product for Russia in a way. And that's speaking to the demographic realities in Russia at the moment. What is quite interesting for me, looking at it from a land power perspective, and one author actually put it like that, there's too few good men for Russia at the moment, if you look at it from a land power perspective. In terms of Russia as a land power, there's no doubt that Russia has always been much more of a continental power than a maritime power. Russia's land power has always been its key military instrument, not its maritime power. And of course, if you look at Russia's traditional approach to security and the use and the employment of its land power, you've always seen the importance of mass for Russia and Russia's doctrine, and of course with that also the ability to respond at a strategic level, to mobilize at a strategic level. I don't want to say anything more than that. Let me move on to China. Of course, geography matters for China. There's the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Yellow Sea. That's a geographical reality for China. It is, in a way, boxing China in. And it's making it very difficult for China to do power projection and maritime power projection beyond the South and East China Sea. And so safeguarding its maritime lines of cooperation is an important part of China's security outlook. All its trade has to come through important maritime choke points into China. So, of course, there's also some important countries sitting around China, Japan, India. So historically, China has always been a continental and not a sea power as well. Though China bowled up a tremendous navy in the last couple of years, historically it has always been a a continental power as well. Of course, the US and China is increasingly looking at the world in a binary way. There's no doubt that we can steer away from them. From a land power perspective, of course, China's focus is on the near abroad. And if I talk about the near abroad, I'm talking about India, I'm talking about Taiwan. And then, of course, land power is a critical element for China, the protection of the Belt and Road Initiative. The Quad countries is a critical, Quad reality is a critical reality for critical variable for China in the environment, the geographical environment it is sitting in. India's and Japan's proximity, geographical proximity is sort of driving that home. And one has to make the point, perhaps, that their support in the Quad countries for the independence of Taiwan, just from a land power perspective. Looking at India from the domestic political perspective, perhaps, and how that ties into land power, Jinping consolidated its power recently, almost pointing to a growth of centralism and authoritarianism. Point is, Chinese society is a highly centralized, highly controlled society. And we've also seen more recently the Chinese economic growth in decline, linked to health, food, and housing challenges facing the Chinese economy. The economic growth have always made up for the lack of democracy and personal freedoms in China. And the question is sort of what is going to happen if the economy is not growing? And we've seen in the relationship between China and the West in particular shifted from an economic relationship, perhaps the United States, from an economic relationship to more of a security relationship. And perhaps that is also what we're going to see increasingly in the domestic environment in China. That's its relationship with this population shifting from an economic relationship to a security relationship. And in China, of course, there's also the question as to, of technology and mass, and the balance between technology and mass in its armed forces. How do you balance the quantitative and the qualitative realities? And China is also sitting with an interesting demographic profile at the moment. Let's turn to India. Of course, there's a question hanging in the air about India's security and whether the balance of threat for India is at sea or across land borders. And that question one is asking against the background of the exponential growth of the Indian Navy in the recent past. Historically, the Indian Army is the prime instrument of fighting of both external and internal enemies. And so there's the question whether the future of India will be dependent on land or on sea force. Will the decisive battles of India's future be fought on land or at sea? And there's some interesting perspectives on that. I think if you turn to India's security perspective and the drivers of India's security outlook at the moment, you will see, of course, the salience of the nuclear competition. But there's no doubt that India is the biggest democracy in the world. It is fielding the second largest army in the world. And with that, India is quite reliant on Russian equipment in its outfit of its military, of its infantry. Of course, there's the question of direct military competition, and in that regard, of course, India, or rather Pakistan and China, features, and also India's regional influence, and questions of countries like Nepal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, countries that's within the regional influence. Of course, the importance of the maritime domain for India to keep its overseas markets and to maintain the security at sea. But then at the same time, the growing cooperation between India and China is not always an adversarial relationship. And it's interesting how at a political level, there's cooperation. If you go down to security and a military level, it's not always the case. So there's a bit of a dichotomy in that. But let me conclude on India. India is a sort of growing in stature as a major power, and that growth in its stature, of course, is bringing the typical dichotomies to the fore in terms of whether India is a maritime or a land power, and it's also highlighting, raising questions about India's position on the Security Council as a major power. Of course, China and Pakistan, that's featuring in India's threat perception. Unlike China and Russia, India has a lot of manpower for its army. Its demographic profile is quite different than that of China and India. It's interesting if one considers the role of what in India's security arrangement, and I've already mentioned the issue of intelligence sharing, that seems to be quite a critical issue. It's also interesting to look at India's interest and the overlap between India's economic and other interest in places like Africa and elsewhere. And then, of course, from a land power perspective, India is looking east and west and not necessarily south. I know there's the importance of the security of the Indian Ocean, but India's security perspective from a land power perspective is to the east and to the west, not necessarily south. So let me turn to South Africa, which is always an interesting country to look at. Perhaps the important point that I need to start off with is the fact that since the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and irrespective of who is governing South Africa, whether it's the English, the Afrikaners, or the ANC, we've always had to deal with three threat domains, threats from outside Africa, whether it's the Germans or the British, or the Cubans or whoever. But there was always the threats from outside that South Africa had to deal with. Then there's the threats from Africa. And then, of course, the domestic threat environment. So there's these three threat environments that is always critical for South Africa's security outlook. And then, of course, Laurie Nathan highlighting the fact that more recently South Africa's foreign policy and ideological outlook have always or is relying on an anti-Western outlook, an Africanist outlook, and a democratic outlook, and then highlighting the tension in that triangle. And it's interesting that it's democracy that falls by the wayside if that tension is sort of driven to the apex. It's just interesting observation from Laurie Nathan. If you look at South African security since democratization in '94, we've had 4 administrations, and each administration has defined South Africa's security in a particular way, starting off with Nelson Mandela. And we have to make the point that in South Africa, in 1994, in the middle of the 1990s, we had the freedom also to conceptualize, to idealize our security, and the freedom of choice to think about how we're going to construct our security. And at the time, in the middle of the 1990s, human security was very much the flavor of the moment in the 1990s. And so South Africa jumped onto this bandwagon of human security. And since then, it has been the declaratory part of South African security, human security. But if you look at the different presidential periods, you will quickly pick up that the Mbeki era highlighted African security, importance of Africa for South Africa and South Africa's security outlook. Of course, a Zuma period that highlighted the importance of regime security, let's say the importance of keeping the ANC as a governing entity. And then the reality is confronting now Cyril Ramaphosa from a national security perspective. We're almost back where we ended off in 1988. How sad is that? And the interesting thing here is that we've literally evolved from an environment where we had the freedom and to choose our conceptual approach to security to a point where realities dictate, and we've in many ways no choice but to make the decisions in terms of the security that's confronting us at the moment. So literally what we refer to as a strategy by design approach to security to a strategy by default approach. It's quite interesting to look at a recent report that was done by Professor Sandy Africa in the aftermath of the July 2021 unrest. She highlighting, the expert panel highlighting 3 critical issues in South African intelligence, or rather South African security landscape, intelligence failure, our intelligence ability have been hollowed out, how the state has basically given up on security, and we see people fending for themselves from a security perspective. I'm always telling my students that we have about 4.5 official private security officials in South Africa for every policeman we have, and that's telling the whole story. And then lastly, how the security apparatus has been hollowed out in many ways. So where does this leave us from a land power perspective? There's tensions between South Africa's foreign policy ambitions and our capacity to support that from a security perspective. Of course, there's a bit of tension between the declaratory stance of neutrality and non-alignment by the government and the preferences of the ruling party. We've seen that in the last month or so. Africa remained a critical part of South Africa's security outlook. And if you look at the critical realities, security realities facing the country at present, there's no doubt that the domestic security environment is the critical priority for South Africa from both a strategic and a capabilities perspective. So from a land power perspective, strategic capabilities perspective, South Africa is, or rather Brics is of declaratory importance for South Africa. And that's more or less South Africa's contribution to that. Turning to Brasilia, I want to say 2 things about Brasilia. I'll be brief on that. The first is that if you look at the Brazilian security threat and security realities, you will notice that it's predominantly land-based. There's very little in the Brazilian security outlook that is taking it to sea, so to speak. It's very much like South Africa, domestic security realities dictate. And if you look at the role that Brasilia have played over time within Brics, you don't see in any way, and I haven't picked up in any of the literature that I've read in the last month or so, any emphasis from the Brazilian side on the importance of land power in its interaction with Brics. So let me conclude. This is a very, very broad overview, but Let me conclude with a couple of critical points, looking at Brics from a land power perspective and asking the question about cooperation from a land power perspective. Of course, there may be political realities and there may be political will for Brics armies and land power capabilities to cooperate, and we'll probably see an expression and a declaratory intention for cooperation in that regard. But armies are difficult instruments, and what we are seeing in terms of armies, simply that they are coming with different doctrines to the table, they are coming with different military capabilities to the table, different equipment to the table, and of course, unlike the Navy and the naval environment and the maritime environment, where there's coherence in terms of legal and the regulatory environment, in armies you don't, in the case of armies, you don't have that. And then, of course, there's the question of interoperability, and that's a critical issue for armies. In navies, that's almost a logical thing to do. The naval tradition is a global tradition, I want to say. But in the case of the army, that is not the case. So there's critical questions about interoperability and the abilities of armies to work together and to cooperate. Of course, I don't even want to highlight the language and cultural barriers. And if I talk about cultural barriers here, I'm not talking about societal cultural barriers. I'm talking about armies as instruments of culture, because every single army in this world has its own culture and its own way of doing things, and they differ vastly from each other. And then, of course, there's also geopolitical tension and a conflict of interest. There's not convergence, if I have, as I've said, and I don't even want to talk about the uneven economic development. We've seen the exercise that is at this moment going on, the naval exercise, and how South Africa struggled to get platforms to see and to participate in the exercise. Yeah, so to conclude, from a land power perspective, the story and the narrative is not necessarily one of cooperation. I think it will take a lot of effort, political effort, strategic effort, operational effort to bring Brics countries together from a land power perspective. Okay, I'm going to draw the line there.
Thank you very much, Professor Weber, for the moving presentation. And so it's now time for questions, comments from the panelists, as well as from the participants who are joining us online. And the topic was economy and security, exploring military cooperation in Brics. So who would like to begin with a question or comment? Yes, please, Professor Ray.
He's my colleague, so I'm going to ask him a very difficult question. Oh, do you think that naval cooperation is an easier field of cooperation than trying to merge or to force cooperation between armies, particularly because of the geographical dispersion of Brics countries?
The first question is, yes, it's quite obvious. The maritime domain is pointing towards cooperation. It is linking Brics. It is what is tying us together. The blue water is the linking domain. If you look at Brics from a land power perspective, you don't see that link. The geographical link is not that obvious. The cultural link is not that obvious, and once again, I'm talking from a military cultural perspective. The equipment link is not that obvious. Ships are ships. Standard operational procedures for navies are more or less the same the world over. It's not the case for armies. They're using different equipment. They have different standard operational procedures. They have different doctrines. So, whereas in the case of the maritime domain, cooperation is a given, I almost want to say. In the case of land power, I don't think it's a given. If you don't put a lot of effort, resources, political will into it, I'm not seeing it unfolding. It is not going to happen by itself.
Yeah, the difficulty that it raises, if the BRICS countries, as they stand now, are largely landward powers. Yeah. And now into the future, you want to look at military cooperation, but then you are left with the easiest pathway runs along the maritime route. But these countries are not necessarily also maritime powers. It's a bit of a conundrum.
I think in the case of China and India, you're sitting with countries with a relatively large maritime dimension and perhaps an aspiration to become prominent and maritime powers eventually. I don't see the other members of BRICS in the medium future at least, becoming maritime and doing power projection beyond its own shores. I don't see that.
Right, thank you. Yes, please, Professor.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was extremely interesting. I will start just write some comment and then probably put a question. As far as BRICS land power is concerned, and the further developments, I would like to mention that actually the land power of our countries is strengthening by cooperation with Eurasian Union. Would be so kind as to show the map to go to the next. The Eurasian Union was founded in 1915 by 5 countries, the post-Soviet countries, and they have the agreement in different fields, in military field also, and they have here the doctrine, military doctrine, according to which each country should help each other in any conflict. And from 2015, it appeared to be several times. And these countries have different agreements with BRICS countries and within our joint projects. We are just within the sphere of mutual interests and participation within BRICS. So as far as the land power is concerned, the Eurasian Union, it's more than 20,500,000,000 kilometers, taking into consideration the economical sphere, citizens that are acting widely in developing the industrial spheres and things like that. It means that any country, BRICS country, or BRICS plus country is strengthened from the point of view of manpower by this economic union. One point. As far as the military cooperation within BRICS, I'm not a specialist in this field, but as far as I understand the declarations, BRICS declarations, there is a possibility for any country to ask for their help, and it will be conveyed. And actually, there are possibilities to help and support the country from the military point of view without judging the length, their geographical distances, because there are new types of equipment that helps just to reach in several minutes the other part of the world. I would like to avoid this sphere of discussion because I would like to state the point that it's not my specialty. As far as the interest and future, trends of cooperation in different spheres, cultural one, economical one, financial one, any kind of. We as BRICS countries declared in these documents for more than 11 years, actually, our interest in different spheres. Security, investments, health, culture, civil activity, and so on and so forth. We see the future, and I would highly recommend all those who have researched within the sphere before judging to look through these declarations that probably reveals all spheres of interests and possibilities for further development. Taking into consideration your presentation, and any person can have its own point of view, I'm fond of repeating it, but just from your point of view, what are the challenges and what are the threats for cooperation of the old world and new world, as BRICS, Eurasian Union, and other developing countries are representing at contemporary moment? Threats and challenges. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. But I want to make a remark or two about the first 3 points you've made. If I look at the map that you've put up, I see countries that's equipped with Russian equipment predominantly, that's geographically tied to Russia, to the Russian culture, perhaps to the Russian language. So there's a foundation for cooperation, and it makes sense from a land power perspective to talk about cooperation.
Sorry, interrupting. The actual situation, as we see it from inside, is not so easy because every country is balancing, because it is
Okay, but the point that I want to make is it's countries that's in a Russian sphere of influence. It's countries that is located in the Russian sphere of influence. And so for South Africa, for example, or Brazil, to tie into that sphere of influence, just from a geographical perspective, it's going to be.
I mean the economic point of view and land power from this point of view, from the creative point of view. No, from the point of view of cooperation, from the point of view of just some contribution to the economic development. I'm not speaking about the sphere of influence because it's the other problem, the sphere of influence. Just to discuss, it's quite important to know the notice, what you consider to be the land power is. I'm considering from the land power in the global environment as the global economy and finance. That's it. And the army, as you have mentioned, is just a kind of a vehicle to protect the interests of any country and just to make the relations of the country to a certain extent secure, yeah, within the environment that contradicts its internal interests.
I agree with you from a holistic perspective. As Francois noted, there's maritime cooperation, there's political cooperation, there's economic cooperation. we talk about the operational realities from a land power perspective at a lower level of cooperating between armies in Brics, it's simply a matter of some countries will be easier to cooperate with than others. I think that's the point that I want to make. And I think this is the point I also want to stress about the difficulty between political will and declarations that are made at a political level versus operationalizing those declarations, especially for armies at an operational level. There may be an intention at a political level, but to operationalize that intention at a lower level is sometimes very, very difficult. And of course, you will have areas of cooperation that present itself as areas of cooperation. I mean, economic cooperation is much more easier to operationalize than deploying militaries and letting militaries interact. Your question about the old world and the new world is an interesting one, and I think there's perhaps a lot of debate that is required in that regard. What I've seen in the case of South Africa in our post-1994 era is that it's not that difficult to walk away from the old world and to tie into a new world. We all know that the world is always in a situation of development, and there's changes taking place almost on a daily basis. So the world is renewing itself on a daily basis. I don't think that's reality. That's a reality. But to walk away from the old world is not that easy. And I'll give you an example. In the case of South Africa, our trade relations before 1994 was predominantly with Africa and the West. And if you do an analysis of South African economic and trade relations at the moment, you will see not much have changed. Of course, we've seen a growth in our trade relations with China. The West is still the most prominent trade partner, South African trade partner. So it's not that easy to walk away from.
Trade. Economically, yeah, and socially, we speak about this field. So it will.
That's precisely my point. So I have no doubt that there's, from the side of the ruling elite, for example, intention to move on to the new world and into new structures, and they have embraced the new world. But it's not that easy to walk away from the old world. There's always some. And I think in the case of Brics or Brazil, it's perhaps the same. I see the tensions in India as well. There's a historical links that India is not going to walk away from. So it's an interesting sort of balancing act between maintaining the good from the old world and embracing what is good in the new world.
But I mean, the other thing is that the role of emerging developing countries in global economy. Yeah, we were describing the economic aspect. The role of these countries is really great, and from this point of view, I have thought the first thing about the challenges, and you have answered it. So then still develop cooperation. Yeah, we have no other way out because any country has its own economic interest. Yeah, and what about the threats?
Yeah, I think the important thing about the threat environment is always the importance to differentiate between the objective and the subjective realities of security. The objective reality is you cannot ignore. That's the kind of realities that is presenting itself, and I think the objective realities, if you look at South Africa at the moment, you cannot ignore issues like crime. You cannot ignore the borders that's open. That's objective realities. But if you listen to the subjective realities of security, how that is framed by the ruling elite, and where the ruling elite preferred to place the emphasis in terms of its security, then the objective realities don't always feature that prominently in the narrative. And I think that's also true of what you are seeing in the world at large, and what you are seeing in Brics, that there's a bit of a tension between the objective realities and the subjective realities. We can have a long debate about what constitutes and what is the objective reality of security in the Brics environment, and how it is, what's the narrative that the political elite is trying to that securities. And in many ways, the security are always defined by the narrative that is presented by the ruling elite. And that's the difficulty of managing the security, is precisely because you're sitting with that tension between the objective and subjective realities of security. And we can take every single one of the Brics countries and you will find some form of tension in that regard. And if you move on to the Brics environment, you will also pick up that realities. Yeah, I'm not going to say anything about that.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Professor Strazer. Maybe one last question or comments for this discussion, then we'll have a break. Thank you.
Something we must remember, you must look back to look forward. When the 89, 90, old world, new world. And in Europe, you had this debate emerge. Do you want to be part of old Europe and maintain old Europe, or do you want to take Europe into a new Europe? If we cascade that down, you can bring it down to a national level in South Africa. 1994, old South Africa, new South Africa. We don't want to perpetuate old South Africa. We want a new South Africa, and neither of these pathways played out as a smooth pathways. All of them played out as very, very bumpy pathways. So many people type of think if you map it out on paper, that's the way you're going to progress. Obviously, in future studies, that's why you will always have high roads, middle roads, low roads in different fancy names. The reality of that is the old and the new brings about its own risks that you have to handle. And if it is a question of you moving to a new world and that Brics could be the shining or leading light in this, it's not going to be a smooth pathway.
And we see in Russia as the dry result is that we should cooperate, live in peace, and respect each other. That's it. Yeah?
Thank you very much.
There is another.
Yes, please, Professor Truger.
Yeah, so I just looked up again what is the per capita GDP of the Brics countries, and I'll give it to you quickly. The Russia and China is roughly $12,000 per capita GDP. South Africa is roughly 7,000. Brazil is there as well, about 7,000. India is about 2,000. So if you look at Germany, they're roughly 50,000. USA roughly 70,000. So my key to us as academics is that we should understand what are the real problems of our society. I'm in favor of Brics working together to make things better, but we should put huge emphasis on making the lives better for the people and then not necessarily for the politicians.
That's the most important thing. Yeah.
So you hear where I want, where I'm coming in is we need to improve the lives. You guys talking about internal threats. We need to improve the lives of our people. And then
Can I just add to what you just said, if you don't mind?
Yeah.
What we have seen in South Africa and a debate in South Africa about precisely that, it's in essence a human security debate, was the importance of capitalizing on the defense budget in order to make the lives of people better. In other words, downscale defense, move that money into the welfare environment to support people. But what eventually happened, and this is the balance that you need to find between providing security and providing welfare and development, is that eventually we've hollowed out the security institutions to the point that the welfare and the development are now under threat. And this is unfortunately, if you neglect security, that where you will end up with. And in South Africa, that tension is going to become a critical one in the next 5 to 10 years.
yeah, no, I agree with you, we should do both. But it seems to me that we don't put enough effort in the economy to change the lives.
It's a fun topic. What you spoke about, Professor, and what you spoke about, and forgive me if I get the facts wrong. Some of these things were happening when I was literally in Kimpies. But I remember growing up as a child and hearing this constantly in the news about the arms deal, and it's a truly hot topic that day. But recently I remember reading that, for example, we spent money on things like frigates to provide naval security and such. And I as an individual, I really don't know how those things have improved my security. I understand ships on the water is good, as you spoke about, but like we're speaking about making lives better for people. I believe that thing was just finished being paid off recently. Has it led to tangible outcomes?
I want my friend Francois to answer this because he's more articulated. But let me say this. And I've highlighted the critical security issues for South Africa. I think our borders are open. We don't have the security forces to protect our borders. People are walking over our borders as if they're walking down the street in Cape Town. And it has economic impact. 87% of the beds in the Gauteng area is occupied by foreigners in hospitals. And that is telling the story of open borders. The crime is telling the story of the open borders. Green security is a critical issue because they're stealing our green security literally from us. Fishing, the fact that our Navy cannot protect our fishing, this is Francois' domain. They're stealing the jobs of South Africans. And I can go on in terms of the effect that the lack of security had. This is just our country. This is happening in every country around the world. So the first role of your military is to defend your own people.
But the military, as you have mentioned, is just the kind of instrument. Does it depend on the political power, all those aspects that you have mentioned?
Of course it is.
Yeah, firstly.
So there's dynamics at play here coming from the political environment to the economic and the security environment.
Thank you so much, Professor Strazer, and thank you very much the panelists and participants. We are now going to break for 15 minutes. We'll resume here at 11:30, so we can continue the third presentation. And we'll close the fourth one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Welcome back to our third presentation for today. And that's on cooperation on countering transnational crime. And the presenter is Professor Pearl Dastil, and she's a Ford Foundation scholar and a professor specializing in criminology and director of postgraduate studies at Walter Sisulu University. We welcome you panelists, welcome you participants, and please, Professor Dastil, proceed.
Okay, thank you very much. It's the morning, good morning. My appreciation for being invited to be part of this project by Professor Kopal. And I am Ngetyambo Pearl Dastil from Walter Sisulu University. I'm going to be speaking on cooperation in countering transnational crime within the Brics context, and also perhaps focusing more on the conceptualization, as well as proposing a reconceptualization of the concept transnational crime, which has so many definitions, and therefore within the Brics cluster, I'm going to be proposing that we need to look at rethinking and reconceptualizing the term so that we then do not seem to be lax in terms of finding measures to counter transnational crime within the African continent and also within the Brics bloc itself. So perhaps it is important to then look at some of the issues which have really been mentioned throughout our conference, which really are the porous borders that we live with, as well as population transfers among and within the Brics countries, and also some huge financial and commercial developments that we've seen, and also issues surrounding communications technology. I think perhaps maybe attempting this from a criminal justice point of view, and also including within criminal justice also some other disciplines as well, which may fall into the cluster of social sciences and not necessarily within the legal perspective. That there are indeed some characteristics that one needs to consider if we are to move towards a rather inter-transdisciplinary definition and conceptualization of the term. And those include really that some of these structures involved in certain criminal offenses tend to be very non-hierarchical and also fluid. Fluid in the sense that in terms of the recruitment of members within these groups, which are really just have no hierarchy at all, you will see that there are many leaders who get to be recruited as old members either quit or, most importantly, incarcerated or imprisoned in some instances. Also, there is what one could call strong links between transnational criminals as well as terrorist groups, and this is even more evident when you look at who forms part of some of these links in transnational crime. And also, if you also look at more literature that is there, you will see that within criminology itself, and I think this also applies to other disciplines, that the term really seems to be defined in terms of who the offenders are or who the victims are. And there is not a consensus among the countries within the Brics themselves to say that we are then, this discipline will approach the concept of transnational crime from this particular perspective and all of that. So you also see that if we look at livelihoods that are threatened, really, those are mainly those livelihoods that live in weak as well as impoverished states. And I think within the Brics itself, you will find these developing countries where really in terms of borders, there is none. One example, for instance, that is glaring in our space, in our in our place as South Africa, you will see that the borders, for instance, just between South Africa and Zimbabwe, for instance, as well as other countries as well, where it is easier for people from those countries to permeate and to come through the borders easily. And those people become then the ones who come sometimes with into countries where already livelihoods are threatened. And already where you find that these states are impoverished and therefore cannot be able to attend to the needs of all these citizens. And also you will find therefore that within these countries, citizens become easy targets. They can be targeted as being recruited into these offenses or partaking in offending behaviors, or in some instances, you'll find that they are easy targets to some of these transnational groups, depending, of course, on the criminality at hand. I'm saying depending on the criminality because I think Prof. Shekhar mentioned that within, for instance, in crimes such as money laundering, there are no visible or tangible victims. So you will find that even within the countries, there are movements within the countries, even before you go beyond the borders of those particular countries. Also important is that there is, what is evident is that most countries really fail to intervene in cases where these crimes are on the increase. And within also these crimes that there is an increase in violent extremism, if we were to look, for instance, at terrorism, that is really affecting the globe. But then what about youth? Youth at the same time are very easy targets to then assimilate into these transnational gangs. And this then permeates to institutions of higher learning. It also goes into centers of entertainment and all those centers where really there is not much security. And in centers where there is no consensus even within the countries to consider ways and measures to really counter transnational crime. And what is then the main pieces? Perhaps in approaching these papers, which I think really can be two papers, is to try and examine new conceptualization of the concept itself, transnational crime. And in that way, then we will not be finding ourselves with misdiagnosis in terms of trying to find measures to counter transnational crime. And secondly, what about then the cooperation within the Brics bloc or within the Brics countries? So that's a second aspect that I will briefly look at, but mainly for this presentation, I'm going to look at the new conceptualization and what should be considered among these countries to have at least a reconceptualized definitions and explanations of transnational crime. Also importantly is that within then these definitions that we currently have, there are contradicting definitions within and among the countries. And also in some instances, you will find definitions such as the one, for instance, provided by Ngo, who then defines transnational crime as a movement of persons, goods, as well as services across sovereign countries and across jurisdictions in a manner devoid of acceptable norms and standards. Those are some of the definitions which are very generic and also they, in terms of their nuances, they become very simplistic to say that we can then rely on them. Perhaps importantly, when we try to do this reconceptualization, we need to look at the existing controls, the nature as well as the dangerousness of the crime. But within these definitions, of course, you will find such more nuanced definitions where this crime is defined, for instance, as planned or executed or has a strong link and an impact on more than one country. So those become now some definitions that one could work with. Also important is that some definitions are very abstract in their nature because there are no multi-stakeholder relations or decisions or discussions that take place. And as a result, you will find that, for instance, if I can just mention within criminology, we look at it from the side of the offender, from the side of the victims. Whereas that if we had more transdisciplinary efforts to define the crime, one would therefore be able to find a definition that is much more nuanced and a definition also that may also extend to other countries, especially if these countries within the global south are looking for funding and are also looking for cooperation with the global north in terms of its efforts to counter transnational crime. Therefore, what you find really are those linear approaches. And because there are changes in modus operandi within these crimes, one then within the BRICS bloc itself, you will find that then some crimes are so, let me put it, are so focuses rather, some crimes are such that for them to be committed, one would include a number of crimes, including in a number of countries, including the global north and also the global south, or within the global south itself. Therefore, if these modus operandi are changing amongst criminals, because also of the way in which technology improves, and also because there is really very limited, in some countries, very limited budgets are given to the state-led interventions. For instance, if you look at the issue of the police, police I think are more, even more relevant to this. If you look at the police, you look at how many stations, police stations are well equipped, for instance, to deal with crimes such as money laundering, to deal with crimes such as terror, and also other crimes as well, cybercrime and all of that. So that becomes really a problem. And within those definitions, we need to perhaps look at what are the community members' needs? Do they need, what do members need from these communities, where at least if some communities are equipped to identify some of those who are involved in these crimes, those communities then will work together with the state, with the governments to be able to come up with multi-stakeholder interventions. Also, the most important part being that who then forms part of the decision-making in reconceptualizing these crimes. That becomes very important because all engagement should definitely be should definitely involve the state. It should also involve the community members at hand. It should also involve in ways where academics, the scholars, and government interventions are brought together so that we can then work together in trying to find long-lasting solutions. Also, you will find that if we look at some theoretical considerations within this, you will find that the main problem is that there are always unsolved political and social political problems within developing countries, and in some instances also within the global north. And as a result, because there are no lasting solutions that are found between these states, you will find that there's always one way in which to deal with for offenders, for instance, it is through imprisonment or incarceration, because that is always deemed as an only measure in which the partaking in these crimes should be. And also that's why you will find that, for instance, within criminology and criminal justice, we speak about the prison industrial complex, where really most, the only alternative to curb some crimes, in fact, most crimes, is through imprisonment. And without necessarily looking and considering what is happening at community level. And you'll find that also what is happening at community level is that there are those unfulfilled human needs. And there is really a catalog of human needs depending on what is the priority of the community and what is the priority of the country. Now, there are a number of these needs. They are not only confined with these, where you find issues of safety, issues of belonging, issues of self-fulfillment, as well as self-actualization. And also where you look at the consistency, recognition as a human being, particularly those who have been denied of humanity. And also, what about the ability of citizens to be recognized by others who live either in the same communities or in the same environments? Of course, we need, therefore, that multi-stakeholder relations to recognize what these needs are. And these needs cannot be uniform to everyone within those particular countries. But I think mostly we need also the political will of government leaders. Is there political will among government leaders, or are there in some instances the beneficiaries in money laundering and in some of these offenses, which really one could say that these offenses are not necessarily for those who live in impoverished, who are marginalized. But in most instances, you will find that within the leaders themselves, they are involved in some way in these offenses. Also then, if we're looking at the conceptual interventions that I want to propose as the paper is taking its shape, I want to then look at a reconceptualization of this crime, which will include the diversity, including as well gender-specific interventions. I'm referring to gender here because if we look at the profile of most of those who are incarcerated for these crimes, the majority will be male. But what about females? Females, females, for instance, they usually are involved as just, helpers, if I may put it another, and never recognized as leaders in some of these offenses. But there are those members who become leaders in these in transnational crime. So what about those? How can we profile some of these offenders? How can we profile as well in most of these crimes which are victims or identifiable victims? How can we then profile the victims in this crime so that we can come up with these definitions? Also important in this reconceptualization is how do we then locate ourselves and highlight the places perhaps where we're writing from, and how do we recognize knowledge from very violent spaces, because we have to come up with this knowledge, knowing that we are threatening, most leaders of these countries. We are also a threat as well amongst the communities that we reside in. Also, perhaps as important is that how can we have safer spaces where we gather and share and reflect on attempts in order to subvert the hegemonic ways of redefining within the Brics bloc. It is important that we revise the origins of the term transnational crime, and also most importantly within the global south. Perhaps also important is for us to be able to, within these reconceptualizations, to come up with a term where at least the marginalized who have been regarded as human because of colonialism agenda as well as the death of cultural pride, how do we then remember these human beings who have always been regarded as non-human? And also within the marginalized communities, what kind of nuanced definitions can they themselves come with? Because remember, this should be a joint effort, and not only the effort of the state, but also there must be some led interventions from communities who are interested in trying to also curb transnational crime. And perhaps if we want to also look at some of the theories now within the blocs or the practices within the Brics bloc, and also we can look at, for instance, an assertion of African identity. We can look at methodologies that are more liberatory in nature, where, for instance, we do not, as academics and scholars, impose definitions to these communities, but we involve communities in that we involve them to narrate what are their experiences of national crime, what are the threats towards the citizens, towards the citizenship in some of these countries, and what about the youth? For instance, how can we also involve the youth? So as those are seen, and they are mainly seen as easy targets, because in countries, for instance, such as our country, where the higher employment rate is there and is a reality, where are the Black youth in this? Where are some youth from marginalized communities when we try to therefore define and redefine transnational crime? So we look therefore at epistemologies that will indeed be less racist in their natures. We look at epistemologies where even within these epistemologies, we can find ways in which to translate what we want to do as a country and what we want to do as Brics in order to make sure that we all participate in curtailing transnational crime. Also important is that then I said the second part, therefore, of my paper will be looking at what then are the cooperations that we need in order to counter transnational crime. And what I'm then suggesting here is that we should acknowledge that there is an ever-changing technique of offenders, particularly in technological crimes, in cyber crimes, and all of that. And also, what then is the challenge? The challenge is that within the countries, either in the global south and also maybe in some countries in the global north, there are minimal budgets in terms of trying to deal with transnational crime, especially those crimes that really include and involve technology. And I think I've mentioned the issue at hand, which is that of a lack of political will. And also, what about legislation? Where are we in terms of legislation? That is legislation that would try to penalize allegiance to criminal groups once identified. And also, perhaps what we will need as well is an improved surveillance as well as enhanced undercover operations. Of course, we can't do all of this if the criminal laws of the countries are not tightened. And again, what about the passport measures? Perhaps for South Africa and also even other countries within the Brics, we will need to look at stricter passport measures so that at least we can avoid tampering with passports and all of that. And of course, our extradition treaties need to be really revised and be looked into so that we can find lasting solutions. So then in terms of the network collaborations, we look at, for instance, how can we devise proactive intervention approaches, for instance, using and utilizing, amongst others, of course, intelligence-led cooperatives. Budget allocation becomes very key here so that we can make some investments into enhanced investigative capacities as well as prosecution stance. And of course, the civil society movement. Because which has in some communities and in some countries really it has become very lax in that most countries or most communities, for instance, depend heavily on the police to counter most of these crimes. So what about then us looking at proactive vigilantism and full cooperation with the police? And of course, this is now from academics, the scholars, the NGOs, as well as media and other entities. Perhaps we need to consider remunerating and also some incentives for community members in order for those community members to be really involved in crime reduction, especially when it comes to transnational crime. Also important, perhaps, I think this is my last one, is that we need to rethink and unthink nuanced definitions. And also we need to perhaps consider conceptual decolonization, that is avoiding or reversing the unexamined assimilation of Western ideas by those who live in African countries. Perhaps almost importantly, we need also to be disobedient, that is rebelling against social sciences, imperialism, and looking, for instance, at us within. What are those nuanced definitions that we can find, which are not necessarily, while they may be unique within the African continent, depending, of course, on where that country is placed, but also those crimes which then can be examined from the space of Africa, within Africa, so that at least when these countries look for increased financial support from the global south, from the global north rather, these countries can be able to say that this is what is unique within Africa. But we're saying unique in terms of saying that these are new definitions that may only come from these countries with specific interventions and also with particular definitions that may feed in within the Brics and also to a society at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dastil, for this excellent presentation on cooperation, on countering transnational crime.
I'm rebelling against social imperialism and my clothes that I wear.
Yeah, That's fine. So please, you are welcome for questions and comments. And we welcome also participants who are joining us virtually. You may put your question in chat or raise your hand. Yes, please.
You mentioned, thank you, You mentioned about identifying knowledge from violent spaces, and you mentioned that some of the people who may be involved in transnational crime may potentially be people of power or people who are very dangerous. And I understand that you're posing it as a question that, you know, for future research. But I was very interested in that. And if you wouldn't mind just maybe commenting on how one could go about, say, designing a research or designing a way to study something like that, because as you said, those people are out of reach, they're dangerous, so forth.
You know, if I look at, for instance, one crime which may be unique to South Africa, but it may also have some transnational indicators within it. I would look at, for instance, the simple crime of taxi violence. Just by way of example. When one looks at the number of taxi, just for lack of another example that I could use really, the number of taxi bosses that are there to combat this crime. I remember we did some research on, I think there's something, it must be, I don't know whether it's peculiar to Durban or also in other countries, where you will find that taxi operators, for instance, are involved, highly involved in tenders where they hijack the building of a particular, you know, whether it's a mall or whether it's just flats and all of that. So the question that was mainly that confronted us as researchers was where is your safety? And then we said that we don't have any security or anything surrounding us. And the question then was, where then do you draw your strength from in order to try and investigate this crime? And what we said indeed was, first of all, we consider the language, the manner in which we approach these taxi bosses. We also consider, most importantly, the language we use in order to build rapport with some of these taxi bosses. And also we said, you know, there's nothing within, and I think in any country for that matter, there's nothing as important as recognizing one's language, as recognizing one's position within where they are, and also importantly, looking at those human needs. Once you deal with someone who does not recognize his or her humanity, then there's no way that you can approach research in the same way. You need to definitely change ways in which you approach any potential participant or any potential subject. And I thought what we need also to do is we need to perhaps change our terminologies in some of these, in some of the research that we conduct, for instance. When looking at really transnational crime, for instance, you're looking at mainly targeting those who are seen as being readily available. We hardly then target those who are really at the apex, of this crime, which is the very leaders of these crimes are we never hear their voices because they are not there. But what do we do as researchers? We always go to those available people that we can find in the streets or anywhere that we can find out. So how about if we change then the way we conduct those who may be involved in some of these crimes? So I think that, I don't know if that explains my situation. Also, if you look at communities themselves, we always go to marginalized communities in order to conduct our research. But those who then live in ivory towers, we never go there because we know that we won't have any access to them. We know that security around them is very strengthened. but we won't go there. But we easily can go, for instance, if you look at, especially if you look at our countries, I think this may be similar to other countries as well. You cannot wake up and say, I'm going to Sandton to conduct research. Just by way of example, I'm going to Sandton and I'm going to knock on these high secured walls, and I'm going to introduce myself and say, I'm conducting research on this and that. Immediately, the doors will be shut on you. So how we conduct research then, even within this, we need to look at some ideas within Africa and perhaps even try to go back to where we come from as a community.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Muta.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your interesting presentation. Can I just have a follow-up question based on your response? Do you think, listening to you, the sense that I get is that we can never win in terms of penetrating some of these crimes that are being committed, based on what you've just said, in terms of us not being able to reach maybe the kingpins behind these crimes. And so could it be why we are struggling to crack some of these crimes, maybe? Or what is your view around the success with which we have as a country, for instance, to deal with some of these crimes?
I think Prof. You will come also here. Of course, that is the main problem, where it is likely impossible without police intelligence and all of that to get to the kingpins who commit these crimes. But I think also it depends also on the nature of the offense, and also it depends really on the modus operandi. If you look again, I'm going to make an example of us as a country where we have this issue of zamazamas and all of that. Somehow the police-led intelligence managed to get to some of these kingpins. I think there were also there were also many, a variety of people involved, your detectives, your this and that, who were involved in cracking those crimes. But some crimes really, I think by their nature, if you look at, for instance, the money laundering, how do we know who's laundering money to and when? What happens within the airports, for instance, where people can go through? If you remember the president's, and the person who not laundered as such, because it's not even considered as money laundering. He just said, no, I walked through the airport with so much cash, but it was like nobody even followed up on him to say, what happened with airport security that you were able to bring in so much? It's not even defined as money laundering. It's just silent on that matter. So I think as long as we have really this huge gap between, I think we've been mentioning it a lot in this conference, the haves and the have-nots, we will always have crimes that where there will always be offenders who are never recognized, and there will be offenders who are never even named as offenders for that matter, because of the status they enjoy within these countries and communities.
Thank you. We can go to Ms. Kaka here, and then we'll go to Professor Strecker.
Thank you. So I'm going to follow up on this question. So do you think a government mandate on auditing accounts that have been traced to suspicious activities can help link certain activities to top people? And do you think it will help in terms of identifying people at the top in the corrupt sphere of what we've been talking about?
Yeah.
And if that will work, what type of consequences do you think should be attached to a punishment whereby they're found guilty that you feel will be effective to discourage other people?
Wow. I think because really these are in some instances within the transnational the umbrella of transnational crime, some of these crimes are well executed. And some of these crimes are really so well executed that to get to the kingpin may actually not be possible. But also, I also think that what kinds of punishment must we look at? I mean, in terms of punishment, we all know that with punishment, it's only the marginalized and those without any financial influence are ever arrested for crimes, unless in some instances where then the very kingpin fights within that cluster of, within the same spies, within the same bosses, or within political organizations and all of that, then you will see that person being singled out and in some instances being incarcerated. But I think if we were to look at some of the solutions within these crimes, I think incarceration should always be regarded as a last resort, because then it would mean, in essence, that in fact, what happens is that within institutions of incarceration themselves, there are so many offenses that happen within the very prisons where we're saying that we are incarcerating people. For instance, things like, drug-related offenses, they are always committed there and committed within some of those institutions. But I think incarceration of the very people high up in the hierarchy should absolutely be considered. The question is, when those people are always highly resourced within the communities that they live in, will they ever be incarcerated? The question, it may be a matter of no, unless there is a political will to keep crime at those levels and not only to target the easy targets and also the marginalized within that process. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Shekhar.
I was thinking as I listened to the ensuing discussion here, I think there is a confusion between the role of a researcher and enforcement. So we're not talking about apprehension, we're talking apprehending the offender. We're talking about research. So our role is different, and we need to think about only getting answers from the prisoners or the convicted offenders. So about being a kingpin and not having access to them, I think that's irrelevant here. You see what I mean? Because as researchers, we are looking for that. So law enforcement's job to bring him to the book. So if we think of getting to him for research, I think we're biting off more than we can chew. What do you think?
Maybe she has a follow-up question or clarification.
But then we do research. We don't do research for the sake of research. We're trying to solve a problem. And I'm just wondering, when we come across these challenges as researchers, are there any recommendations maybe that we could make based on what we have discovered on the ground as we did research to inform intervention? I'm just wondering.
But I think we need to acknowledge our limitations.
Professor, yes.
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. I'm very interested in the last two bullet points in this slide. Maybe because that hasn't been implemented, we still have such a problem. Can you tell me how you foresee addressing those two last bullet points is going to improve the security going forward? What kind of things will have to happen? What kind of decolonization? What needs to be removed and what needs to be replaced? And what kind of epistemic disobedience do you foresee?
Okay, I think first of all, when you look at decoloniality itself, you're looking at various issues that need to be addressed. You're looking at the issue of power, and also perhaps let me put it this way, who then within the power structures that are there in societies and communities, who is responsible for the generation of that knowledge? Where does the thinking come from? Does it come from the communities themselves, or is it something that is imposed on the communities by those who belong to other worlds and also who belong to other communities? If you look at the ways also we conduct research, which I think also I also mentioned, we need to look at whether that research has participation from the communities involved. So that is what I'm talking about. I'm also looking at instances where whenever we conduct research, where do we always go in terms of our literature, in terms of what we really write about, in terms of what we propose? We propose interventions which may not necessarily be community-based, but we propose interventions that are imposed on us by elsewhere. Does it mean that we as Africa, I'm just making an example, we as institutions within the Brics, does it mean that we cannot come up with our own definitions, which may be specific, and in some instances, which may be unique to our own needs? I would look at, for example, examples of body, what is this, what is that crime again? I can't remember the name of the crime, but what I can think of is, if you look at, for instance, multi killings and all of that, are they specific to Africa? Are they not there in some of these countries within the West? But within Africa itself, how can we then come up with ideas where we explain these terminologies in ways that can at least be understood by those who are on the receiving end of some of these offenses, for instance? It doesn't mean that because there's money laundering, that money is only exchanged, for instance, within different countries. It also may be exchanged within the same community. I think when we were talking about the other day, we mentioned, I think it was Prof. Kruger, who mentioned something about what's that crime that you mentioned? Or Mashonisa, for instance, I think if you can, I'm not sure if you know the term, where there are clubs within communities and all of that. So what happens if one of those communities comes from our sister country, Lesotho, Zimbabwe, and all of that, and deals with that money completely to go and build something? Do we call that, for instance, do we define that under the umbrella of organized of transnational crime? Maybe not, because those are crimes that are only committed by those who really are considered as non-human within the society or within the community, because by the virtue of their status. The disobedience in this instance will have to really be in terms of looking at within the Brics countries, within the Brics states. How can we think about crime in general? How can we think about offenders or even victims for that matter? How can we think about these three in ways where the one who will be incarcerated will also be able to be assimilated into the community, which is not something that is there in most of some of these Western ideas or ideas from the global South. What about incarceration itself? What about us questioning incarceration? Was there incarceration before globalization, before colonization, and also other ills that affected South Africa? But if you look at the history really of incarceration itself, it was not there during those times. So who imposed incarceration, and what were the ideas behind incarcerating people, where the majority of those incarcerated is very clear? For instance, it is those mostly who are Black, who are colored, and also who are other colors. But then some people are not easily incarcerated because they have the resources, to buy themselves out of prison, to even buy themselves out of incarceration. So perhaps we as researchers, we as communities, we need to just disobey that which is there, epistemically and otherwise, and also to try and look at social science as part of us who are the holders of that particular knowledge. I hope I'm clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dastia. And I don't seem to see any questions from the chat from our participants. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you very much indeed for this wonderful presentation. And thank you, panelists, for this conversation. and thank you to the viewers and participants online. So we'll be now shifting to the fourth presentation for today. So in 1 minute or so, we'll be just exchanging seats here. Thank you. Thank you very much for waiting. And I'm George Mutalemwa, your presenter, but we have our facilitator who is Professor Sheka today, and she will oversee everything that we are doing. And the topic is a discourse on religious best practices in peace building by Brics countries. Right, I would like to begin with a short background that has led to this topic. And this follows a resolution, which I call ACUHIAM. Now, ACUHIAM stands for the Association of Catholic Universities and Higher Institutes of Africa and Madagascar. So the Association of Universities, represented by vice chancellors, presidents or rectors in Africa and Madagascar. Now, in 2017, there was a resolution that all African Catholic universities and higher education institutions should have a department of peace studies. That actually follows two other decisions made earlier in Africa, particularly 2014 in Johannesburg and 2010 in Bujumbura, Burundi, where Catholic universities decided that we should really put an emphasis on peace studies. But come 2017, there was now a formal resolution that all universities should have this, should have a department of peace studies, because of course of the necessity of having peace and studying peace, and are trying to deal with violent conflicts in Africa, but also all over the world. Now, in 2019, we decided to have a program, or started as a project, known as Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa. And there was a meeting that took place in Germany and was attended by Professor Egon Spiegel. He's a professor of theology at the University of Fechter. It's a public university, but it started as a Catholic university. And with the Professor Liu Cheng from Nanjing University in China, and myself. And later on, we were joined by Professor Lester Kurtz from George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia, USA. And then we started actually conceptualizing what we can do to implement this idea of mainstreaming peace studies across Catholic universities. Of course, I would like also to state here that the emphasis then not shifted or just added another important aspect, that we are not only concentrating on Catholic universities, but rather education as a whole, even for non-Catholic institutions. Then in 2022, so last year, the Africa Peace and Development Network was born in Juba, South Sudan. Now, this was a network of scholars, including the ones I just mentioned from China and the US and Germany, but also from Africa and all over the world. And we decided that we should name our network Mtandao wa Amani na Maendeleo Africa. That's Swahili for the Africa Peace and Development Network. So, I'm trying to... Right, so what's the vision and the mission of the MAMA, so the Global Peace Studies for Sustainable Development in Africa? Is making Africa Peace Scholarship rise and shine again for an educated, peaceful, and sustainable world peace. Africa has a contribution to peace studies and scholarship, but it's not always recognized. And the idea is to establish and sustain, because now it's established, to sustain a special global network of peace builders with a focus on Africa. The motto is peace and well-being for all, forever. So we are here combining two aspects, peace building and sustainable development. And our values include dignity, freedom, equality, integrity, and non-violence, which of course you can find in the philosophies of Ubuntu, Ujamaa, Satyagraha. And these are quite really related to even to religious thinking. And the approaches are transdisciplinarity and multiculturalism, as well as internationalization. So as we can see, for example, in Brics, that the 5 countries are coming together, or more will join, as we proceed. But in global peace, we'd like to include everybody really, and discuss and find out how we can build peace together and have a sustainable world. We have a number of partners. I've just mentioned the University of Pechstein in Germany, Nanjing University, China, George Mason University, Universidad de Congreso in Argentina, the International Federation of Catholic Universities, the Catholic Peace Building Network, the International Peace Research Association, and the Africa Peace and Education Association, and so on. Now, what are some of the things that we do, our activities? Because these, for me, I regard them as the best practices, or one of the ways of explaining the best practices. Publications. In terms of books, we've published one, and 2 others are under review, and they are co-edited by the 4 people I've just mentioned, from Germany and China, the US and Tanzania. But we also have Wednesday online sessions. Actually, even today, there will be one starting at 3 o'clock. Of course, you are invited. Where we have these weekly webinars. We just have a special theme for each week, but it's all about peace and development. We haven't started exchange programs, but we offer to start so that, people, students and staff can move from one university to the other to learn about peace and share our own experiences and strengths. And also eventually would like to start with a Master of Arts in African Peace and Sustainability Studies. Because once we train, let's say, people at master's level, postgraduate levels, then we train future teachers who will help young students and pupils in the long run. And we also intend to have international conferences. This is just an example, though I wish I could make this one a bit larger, but an example of themes. As I said, they're very multidisciplinary. And in fact, this one, the speaker is from, we had two speakers, and they had a book launch. And one was actually from Professor Tim Murithi, who is at Cape Town University, and Professor Laya Sopongo from Hekima, that's the Catholic University in Kenya. We have Professor Hager from the UK, from Essex, University of Essex, talking about the supranational world government. So we have a number of issues, climate change, religion, etc., gender. It's very diverse and multidisciplinary. Now we are envisaging, planning to have a conference held in Tanzania. The dates are not yet set, but the conference theme will be from Ubuntu to Ujamaa, Nyerere's legacy and the future of world peace and development. Of course, probably you all know Julius Nyerere, the former president of founding father of Tanzania, and is actually this year 100 years of his birth, if he were still alive. So we'd like to dedicate our conference in discussing these ideas. Because as you can see, these are not religious ideas as such, but again, they are very related also to most of what many religious traditions also promote, these ideas of respect and being humane and promoting humanity, as it were, respect, etc., and cooperation. And I think that's what also Brics is trying to do. And I'm sure these ideas are also very essential for Brics. This is just our first book that I mentioned. It's about 800 pages. It was published by Springer. And also it's available in a series known as Advances in African Economic, Social, and Political Development. And the two other books that are being reviewed will also be published by the same company, Springer International. And the title for the second book is Peace as Non-Violence, Topics of African Peace Studies. And the third book has the theme Global Peace and Sustainability Studies, Legacy and Transformation. Now, what are some of the key lessons? The first one is that religion, generally speaking, and peace building are interrelated. Of course, I know that there are some aspects of like violence, etc., that are connected with some religious groupings or groups. But generally, look at Islam, look at or Hindu or Buddhism or Christianity, etc. I mean, they are all looking at peace building, the promotion of peace, for individuals, but for communities and nations. And so again, cooperation in global peace goes beyond religious demarcations. Somebody, actually, Professor Kruger was asking me the other day whether, being let's say, our network being religiously based, whether that excludes others, and we are saying not. And especially that we are coming from this Catholic tradition, we believe in universal values, and therefore we are very open-minded. And the third one is that the emphasis on education is crucial for all, but also, of course, in Brics, that the matters we are discussing here, the questions of security, just amazing stuff, you know, whether it's cybercrime or maritime security and what we've discussed so far, you find that it's really very important, but in often cases, some people are not educated, are not even informed about them. And for that reason, they can easily be, you know, vulnerable, and they can easily be manipulated and abused because of ignorance. And so we are trying to say here that the emphasis in education really is crucial, where we have all these aspects of, you know, peace, the values being internalized by people, and at all levels of education, whether the university level, the middle level, secondary schools, and nursery schools. And in fact, this information should go into families where people and children also learn the values of peace building as young as they can be. So thank you very much for listening to me, for your kind attention. I would like to welcome you for questions and comments. Thank you. Yes, please.
I really enjoyed your talk, and I learned quite a bit about peace building and its effect on reducing, you know, you were basically describing violent extremism at a certain point. And I do realize some of the colleagues have spoke about how, you know, land force and military action is sometimes the thing that is overemphasized, and I say sometimes reasonably so. There's a threat, you have to deal with the threat. But I also appreciate where you say that lessons of peace building can and should be brought into the family structure and try and teach even young people about some of those values. And so I was wondering, what are some of those values and how can we approach, like, for example, I have a younger sister. I would like to teach her about peace building, but I have not had that type of conversation with her because I think she's a bit young for it. So if I wanted to have that conversation, how would you recommend I bring some of those topics to her?
All right. Thank you very much for that great question. The other question of values. First of all, what are these values? And then how can they be taught, as it were, you know? I think that, as I pointed out, you know, the values, for example, Ubuntu, you know, Ujamaa, Satyagraha, and Sankofa, you know, going back to the roots, because, you know, like in Africa, there were issues and values that were transmitted, of course, are still transmitted, and some of them maybe are forgotten, that, you know, there is a little conversation going on, and particularly with the current, you know, population or generation, where many children are interested in just what is happening online, you know, the social media. Now, listening to elders, for example, the parents, that's becoming a challenge. But if we have these values where we say, okay, we respect each one, you know, regardless, you know, of who they are. And there was a day actually, one of the, actually my son talked about a story of Ubuntu, you know, that somebody's given sweets like these ones, and they're saying, okay, put these sweets under a tree. And then the children run together and say, okay, the one who gets there first will have all the sweets. And then they decide all the children to hold each other's hands. So they run together so that they all arrive at the same tree so that they can share all the sweets together. Now, this is, I think, it's a story that, children can understand, that if you want really peace, of course, you work for justice and work for equality, not really competition, but cooperation. And let's share the little that's available. So that would be one of the methods of teaching, children about peacekeeping. Thank you. Yes, please, Professor Matwane.
Thank you very much, Prof, for your presentation. I was drawn by the use of one word there when you started. You said peace and well-being. And I was drawn to the concept of well-being, because well-being can be defined from a multiplicity of perspectives. How do you see well-being in this context?
Right. Thank you very much. Again, it's a question of, and I'm using it from the development, social development perspective, well-being, where people, regardless of their status or class or whatever, that they are able to have the basic needs, at least, they should be able to afford living in a dignified life. Okay, so poverty, for example, should be excluded. That should be replaced with, with wealth, as it were, with having some kind of prosperity, by having income, by having food on the table to eat, right? For me, that would be well-being. And of course, being also healthy. It's so, almost everything that is discussed in the Sustainable Development Goals really is gearing us towards well-being, of individuals and societies. Yes, please, Professor Bray, then we'll go to the next.
I want to ask you, I'm not so certain that I get the gist of what you presented. Do you propose a Catholic platform that you can use within the Brics context to have religious influences of do good, do the right thing in the Brics community, irrespective of the religions, because you're now talking about an array of religions? Or do you propose that your religious communities and entities in Brics should use their influence in order to help educate and socialize societies to do the right thing? Which one is it?
Well, thank you very much for this good question. I'm using religion as a standpoint of this network that I'm also representing and presenting here, this, the African Peace and Development Network, where the starting point has been religion. However, the issues that we deal with are informed by religion, but they are accommodative. So we take views from various religious perspectives, not only the Catholic one, but what is good in Islam that can be promoted, or in Hinduism that can be promoted within the Brics countries. So we have common values. Before actually I started interacting with people from various perspectives, I was like, should I say, narrow minded. But now, getting various perspectives from various places, this is what people do in China. You have ideas coming from Buddhism that you find that really very similar, to what is practiced in Catholicism, for example. What is practiced in Islam is very close, So if we take all the good points from various religious traditions, then we are able to form a strong collaboration within the Brics that will not leave anybody behind, as to put it that way. So religion can help us, but not only religion. We are saying that even those people who do not profess any religious tradition, but they've got some great ideas and values, they are welcome to share those with us, as long as we work towards having, building a more sustainable, a more inclusive society. I hope I have understood your question and answered it.
It's okay. I've just got this notion. Do you call on the intuition of Brics country leaders and institutions to listen to religious communities as forces for good? Or do you think there should be a Brics entity that stands for religion in order to have the goodwill, etc., from religion filter into Brics countries? But it's okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I actually make a comment on that? So basically, maybe I'm repeating information that's known, and I probably am, but from my presentation from the two tomorrow, I found out that, for example, and it says in some of the Brics declarations was UN resolutions, that religion becomes for violent extremists a misinterpretation, mischaracterization. Perhaps what you are suggesting might actually be a good idea, implemented maybe region by region with people from the region to actually address that issue of that mischaracterization. And it's so relevant, it's such a relevant topic that even social media companies like Facebook, there's another company called Moonshot, which detects when individuals are searching for content which may lead to their radicalization. What this company does is it detects when those keywords are entered into a search engine and pushes them back into a YouTube playlist of content that is positive toward religions. So if they're implementing this in a technology format as is, maybe it's not such a bad idea to actually have institutions out of Brics that can work towards redirecting those that are vulnerable to radicalization, provide them with information such as what Dr. George is talking about. Maybe it can make a difference.
All right. Thank you so much, Daya.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you,
Professor
Professor.
Flecker.
I was just wondering, because your students will be doing the dissertation, right? At the end of what are the topics that they would generally choose for their? Just curious.
Right. Thank you very much. This idea is we are still thinking about. We haven't started offering any degrees, so we'll prepare a program manual, and but definitely some of the issues will be the African, traditional religions, etc., and African thoughts in peace building and the roots. So we have a number of things, because this will be an international a master's degree. So we'd like to accommodate really some views from other countries and perspectives. Thank you.
I may just add a comment. I think it has to start off with ground up qualitative research to define what there is, because I don't think there's a full knowledge of what there is within the different cultures that's been looking. I think what I find interesting about your topic is it's brought to this forum the BRICS Forum, how do you see that will take it from the local perception of peace, well-being, to an international level where there are such disparate cultures and religious backgrounds?
Yeah.
How do you see it going from where we actually don't even know where we're starting from to an international consortium?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that the starting point is the conversations that we have, in terms of webinars that we organize every Wednesday. So, because participants and speakers are from various religious denominations or practices and none, they are all invited, and therefore we record, their presentations. And in fact, our third book is based on the webinars, on the presentations that are done. So we invite speakers also to prepare a book chapter. So there we'll have a lot of data from where we can start applying. And the idea of doing research, that we've already actually prepared a questionnaire, to people. We also did a qualitative research on just one university, just to see the relevance of peace studies. And that was actually in Tanzania, St. University of Tanzania, which the results were published in a book. And so we will gather more information. This is really the starting point. Of course, we've been doing this for the past 1 year, every Wednesday. So we are gathering a lot of information, but we needed to really concentrate now on what is available and what can be utilized and be part of the curriculum.
Adding to what Colleen was saying, I think the world is taking a different turn, because a month back I was in Bar-Ilan University in Tel Aviv, and they had organized the first conference on forgiveness and forgiving as a means of conflict resolution. So it was difficult to digest, and we had speakers who had their parents killed by terrorists, brothers killed by terrorists, and they spoke about forgiveness. So I think it will take some time for us to come to terms with this.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Easiest track is
the
military and the security thing.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much indeed. And I don't see questions from the participants. Maybe you can share with us the last word for today. As please.
So thank you very much, Professor, for taking us through a different line of thought at the fag end of this Roundtable conference. And thank you to all the participants for sharing your thoughts as well. So we won't stand between you and your lunch. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I guess